Welcome to Trace Neuroanalytics, Episode 8. My name is Nikki, and today we will be together taking a first look at an EEG that I recorded personally here in my office on a good friend who has an interest in meditation, in telepathy, in different healing modalities, and interpersonal communication. And I'll provide some more details on what his interests and sort of goals might be with understanding the EEG and neurofeedback possibilities towards the end. If you want to skip ahead to my completed interpretation and analysis of this EEG, you can go to the end of the video. And if you want to see my live processing with the artifacting procedure and the neuropsychological interpretation, stick around. Thanks for watching. Please do subscribe to the channel. And if you would like one of these videos for yourself on an EEG, please go to traceneuro.co. And as a reminder, this is a non-medical interpretation by some guy on the internet with an interest in EEG, a lifelong student of the EEG. So none of this is diagnostic. And my intent with this is to open the conversation and open some curiosity around what's going on in the brain. So thanks for watching, and let's begin. And I will be describing this process for someone who is more or less a beginner. Right now, this data is in the average reference. So we've removed the ears as references and compared each of the individual sites to the average of all of the scalp sites. And the odd numbers here on these sensor locations on the left here are on the left side. The even numbers are on the right. We have the front of the head above the eyebrows here at the top, and the back of the head and the occipital lobe at the bottom of the screen. CZ is the vertex, right at the very top in the middle. T7 is sort of by the left ear, T8 is kind of by the right ear, and we can identify the other channel locations as we go along. And this is the uncleaned data. So I will be scrolling through the whole record before attempting to clean the data and trying to identify features in sort of an iterative approach. So let's get started. So the first thing we notice is the amplitude of the EEG. And on the left here is the scaling, and with my scroll wheel, I am adjusting the gain, and that's changing the scaling in the microvolts per centimeter vertically. So my first observation is that this is not a low voltage EEG. Typically, we have 50 microvolts scaling as the kind of standard. And in this case, if we go down to that scaling, then the signals start overlapping one another. We have some eye blink, which is typical at the FP1 and FP2 sites. We have some FZ slowing here, which means that there are these waves that are kind of in the alpha range, 10 cycles per second, roughly. We have 4 of these little wavelets in 2/5 of a second. These numbers up top are the seconds. So we have some alpha activity up front, and in this recording, we're looking at the eyes open. So it's not uncommon to see some alpha. We see an eye blink, and then we see kind of a reduction in the background rhythm, where that alpha rhythm that was present, not just frontally, but posteriorly, sort of drops out. So this is showing us that there's a little bit of shift in state happening already, even in the eyes open at the beginning of this recording. So we're going to start scrolling through the EEG, and this was one where I was just getting my new setup using the free EEG 32 open source acquisition device running, as well as a new cap system, the Tenocom saline cap. So I did do a decent amount of fiddling around with sensors at the beginning of this recording, so we may have to scroll past a decent amount of noise induced by playing around with the cap and sensors in order to get to some good data. And thankfully, we have a plenty long enough record to be able to still get a good sense of what's going on in this brain. We're noticing that the P8 electrode is maybe a little bit more unstable than the rest of the sensors. And I'm actually going to scroll forward a little more quickly here so that we don't waste any time unnecessarily. And we can see that the background rhythm is a mix, right? Because previously we saw alpha rhythm kind of dominating. Now it's a little bit lower voltage, and we do see more beta activity, this faster stuff that has more peaks per second. So if we take a look at this fifth of a second right here, we roughly have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this is around, let's say 25 hertz activity, beta content. And it's normal for there to be a mix in of beta activity in the eyes opened condition. And then we also see some interesting stuff happening here at P8. And I'm a little bit skeptical of this because we did note a little bit of sensor instability. And it does seem like there's this kind of slow stuff at P8, which may not be real. So here we see kind of like a burst of beta band activity at P3. And this does look real, given that we're not really going to expect muscle activity in this region, and also muscle activity would have a much spikier kind of appearance than what we're seeing at P3. And it is somewhat notable because we don't generally, in the eyes open, see this amount of sort of a focal beta finding in this left superior parietal region. So if we count the peaks here, we see 1, 2, 3, 4-ish peaks in a fifth of a second. So this is sort of 20 hertz beta activity. Scrolling through, more eye blink, more of this sort of fast activity in the left superior parietal, and a mix overall of alpha and beta. Jaw tension, high amplitude alpha activity now at P3 and somewhat at PZ. And P8 is looking quite unstable as an electrode, rather. So we will need to clean that up to remove some of that slow sway. So this is really just a quick scanning of the features, not for the sake of interpreting what's happening, but just to sort of notice anything that's going to be relevant for how we do the ICA, independent component analysis, artifact rejection, to make sure that we get rid of the artifacts that we want to get rid of, and we don't get rid of the real EEG brain activity that is really there. So I always look at the whole file before doing the ICA de-artifacting. And then once it's clean, take a little bit of a deeper look. And so far, we're seeing some consistent features, this general sort of like beta activity and this posterior alpha activity, which is a classic distribution. This frontal beta is a little more energetic than I would want it to be. And here we see at T7, which is the right midtemporal region, left midtemporal region, kind of its own independent alpha rhythm that's sort of triangular in shape. Um, and we see this beta activity sort of looking more like beta spindles. So this is the beta is starting to look a little bit like hyperexcitability. And now in the left temporal lobe, we're seeing an alpha feature where we don't typically see it, right? The main alpha generator is the posterior, sort of parietal and occipital alpha. Um, and the fact that we're seeing alpha in this sort of more isolated focal manner at T7 may be an indicator that there is some idling there, specifically that we may want to address. Right? Alpha is the idling rhythm of the brain. It's not just relaxation, it's actually cortical inhibition. And when we see it in a focal place, that's not the classic sort of parietal thalamically generated alpha, it can be a sign that that region is shutting off for some reason. And we certainly wouldn't want T7 to be shutting off. Here, the alpha rhythm is getting, at PZ, is getting larger in amplitude, and we see it also projecting to FZ. And interestingly, it's not just volume conduction that is creating this frontal alpha activity. So there may be a sign of some frontal slowing. And it's possible that that alpha activity could be sort of compensatory or counterbalancing the relatively high amounts of beta that we see frontally, right? So this is kind of a good example of the background where we see mostly alpha at the back of the head and then mostly beta at the front of the head. It's kind of a striking difference. We expect for there to be some anterior to posterior gradient in the amounts of alpha. But this amount of frontal beta might be a sign of a kind of a cortical irritability or hyperexcitability. So we've now gotten to the end of the record, and we do have quite a bit of kind of these like slow sensor pops to clean up. More than is ideal. So this, this acquisition platform with the free EG32 and the Tenocom saline cap is still under development. I'm very excited about it. And the slow drift and these sort of pops that we're seeing, I think have more to do with the saline cap than they do with the amplifier itself. That's something that I'm exploring as far as how to get better quality recording. And hopefully this will be usable for our purposes here. So we've just put the data through the ICA algorithm, and we now have sources that with these topographies that we can select to see if we can remove them from the data if they're artifactual, and of course keep them in the data if they are real. So this is where the human supervision of the machine learning algorithm is quite important. And off the bat, I'm not loving these first two iBlink components that we're getting. So here we have the now excluded artifacts after we've selected these two topographies, which coincidentally happen to be the same like lines here, but actually the topographies aren't a match with the channels by definition. It just is coincidence in this moment. But the reason I don't love this is because we're kind of flattening FP1 and FP2, and here you can see that it's removing some of the genuine, alphoid content that's happening right now in the corrected EEG. So I'm going to play around with the algorithms a little bit to see if we can get a better component for specifically removing the eye blink topography. So we're going to switch from the fast ICA to the Infomax, which is the standard one, and see if we get a better result. And this one is doing a better job of combining the two eye blink topographies. We still have a little bit of a disparate effect from FP1 to FP2. And if we select the FP1, we end up squashing that somewhat. But I'm a little more optimistic about this Infomax source separation. So we're going to roll with it for now. And the other question is how much frontal muscle activity are we going to try to remove? Another challenge with this platform as it currently is the amount of 60 hertz line noise that is coming in from the room. So actually, even prior to importing this data into WinEEG, in EEG Lab, you can see that I did a band pass of 2 to 40, which means we've removed that line noise, but also reduced our capacity to eliminate the muscle tension, which includes a decent amount of higher frequency components from this data set using ICA. So if we had more of that information, the ICA sorting algorithm would potentially have more data to work to chew on in order to get these sort of muscly periods out of the data. But such is life. We never have perfect data. And so far, I'm happy with the 3 components that we've removed. Now the question is, are we going to be able to get rid of that super slow sway that's happening at P8, which looks like it's going to be that component? We'll scroll through and see how that does. We also have this at T7. We can see P8 has been corrected, and now T8 is also going to be corrected. We're getting rid of some of those big slow drifts from the sensor instabilities. It looks like we still have some at C4. And the more of these components that we pull out, the more we are at risk for squashing some of these channels. But so far, I am content with the amount of EEG squashing relative to the relative cleaning effect. Here we have an FZ component that's pulling out that slow sway from sensor drift. And our goal here is not to make the whole record perfect, because we can also just snip out certain time periods of this record in order to be able to process it accurately using the fast Fourier transform, which is the so-called Q quantitative of QEEG, quantitative EEG. So let's see, maybe we have a good P3 component. We don't seem to. Yeah, I think we're done here. So it looks like F8, we still have this slow stuff in here. So now we can set some filter parameters for our voltage threshold artifact rejection, which means we click on Mark Artifacts and we tell the software to sort of snip out anything that is larger than particular amplitudes. And I'm forgetting what the general rules are here as far as the numbers. Usually we take like the kind of scaling that we're at and set that as the voltage condition for absolute voltage. And then for slow waves, you'll do something like a fifth of that or a fourth of that. Right now, I'm going to err on the side of more conservative, of taking out less and say 20. And for fast waves, since we have a decent amount of beta, actually, start even easier than that. Let's say 35 and let's say 20 for fast waves. Click OK. And let's see what we pulled out. So good. We're getting rid of the really egregious muscle tension moments, and looks like we haven't taken out quite enough. So in this area, we definitely want to take out more than we're currently taking. So let's do slow waves and let's bring that down to 30. And let's take fast waves down to 15. Still didn't take out very much more. So now we can see that this is captured in the slow wave rejection. We're getting closer, and maybe that we kind of just have to look past the kind of sensory instability that's happening at F8. And what looks like cardiac at CZ. And the other thing to keep in mind here, for the nerds out there, is when we are doing this artifact rejection, it's only going to take 4-second epochs or epochs. Epoch. So, for example, this is not going to be included because there's a piece that's cut out here and here. Um, and we're also scanning this to, see if we identify other features in the raw that we didn't the first time around. We noted the amount of frontal beta that's present. We noted the relatively normal alpha background rhythm originating from the parietal lobe, and a relatively normal sort of distribution as far as the anterior posterior gradient of the alpha activity. And we noted this beta that sort of does show up in sometimes spindles, this sort of hyperexcitability, which we, for example, right now see frontally, and we see left parietally. We see kind of like originating here at P3 and projecting to PZ, P7. So there's some kind of irritative process that's happening in that left left superior parietal region. And we've noticed a little bit of left mid-temporal alpha occasionally. So some idling on that left side, as well as some hyperexcitability in sort of like the left parietal region. And I think we want to adopt a little bit more of an aggressive filtering here. Now we're going to get a little bit less of that slow sway. And it is taking out more of the data. So one thing we could do is switch to 2-second epochs so that we're not losing as much in these sort of in-between zones right here, right? So let's try that. And now I feel like we've taken out a little bit too much. I'm going to clear all, and I'm going to go back and switch this to 9. And we're still removing sections where it's not really necessary to. So let's go back to 10. Oopsie. All right. I'm reasonably satisfied with this. I'm impressed by this left superior parietal funkiness that's happening here. It seems to be higher in amplitude in the alpha range when that happens, and then also in this like low beta range. So something's going on there. And let's take a look at the spectra, shall we? We're going to do the entire EEG file since we have removed the sections we don't want to process. And here we have our EEG spectra, the so-called QEEG. I'm going to change the scaling of this a little bit so that it's easier to see. All right, that didn't change it. Whatever, WinEEG. I don't know what you're doing to me, but all right. So here we now have a graphical sort of display of what's going on. And here's the back of the head, and here's the left ear and the right ear, and here's the front of the head. And I was trying to change the scaling here so that we could see the whole thing all at once. And for some reason, I thought that the change that I just made would allow us to do that. Graph formats. This is where one would imagine the scaling of these things would be located. Well, so it goes. Let's put back in our maps window. Wait, no, that's not the one that we want. Watch me play around with the settings in WinEEG. That's the one that I just added. All right, you know what? I'm not going to worry about it right now. What do we got? So we have our algorithms, which are the largest features in the EEG. I'm going to right click and generate a map for that, which is down here. So we can see, as expected, that the predominant algorithm does have its peak at P7. Now, interestingly, we also see a slower alpha peak. And the slower alpha peak can potentially suggest that there are areas of the brain that are experiencing some ischemic changes, a lack of blood flow. And we see that this right occipital and posterior region has more of that slower alpha. That's about 1.5 hertz slower than this sort of dominant parietal rhythm. We also see kind of a faster alpha feature here at C4 and C3. That is 10.74. Potentially mu rhythm, although we didn't necessarily see that in the raw EEG. But we basically do see these two different rhythms, or two different predominant rhythms of alpha, which again, the slower one might have something to do with blood flow changes, or it may have something to do with state changes and sort of like a different level of kind of arousal. This slow feature here was what we were not able to kind of get rid of as far as pulse artifact is concerned in the raw. So I'm not going to worry too much about that. And this feature right here, this beta that's in the sort of 17 hertz range, that's what we saw in the raw EEG as this sort of interesting hyperexcitability in that left superior parietal region. So that's potentially concerning. It's not typical to see that there. Just a peek at the EEG coherence. We're not seeing anything that's super hypercoherent. So now if we want to get a full view of the spectra that we just generated, I'm going to use this print preview function, which seems to do a better job of getting everything on the screen. And also, for some reason, takes WinEEG a little while to generate. So we can have a sip. Reminder to subscribe to the channel. We have some exciting podcast episodes, some great demos of different neurofeedback tools and QEEG tools coming up, conversations with some great friends in the world of QEEG and mental health. And if you're interested in one of these reports or want to make sense of your own brainwave data in more depth, you can do so at traceneuro.co. So this is the visual representation that I would love it if WinEEG would just let us generate in the first place. But we just get to see from the top down of the head. This is the front, this is the left ear, right ear, the back of the head, the different amounts of these different brainwaves. And if this wasn't clear at the very beginning, this yellow zone is like sort of from 8 to 12 hertz cycles per second. And so that's why this peak that's sort of above the 10 hertz notch here is showing us this 10.75 hertz faster alpha feature here at P3. So we're going to just kind of bookmark this. We have 98 epochs, which means that we have 400 seconds in total out of the 700 that are being used to generate this quantitative spectral time frequency transformation of the raw EEG data. And we've identified some potentially significant features. And for now, we're going to leave this and check out the eyes closed data. So here's our eyes closed. Go back to the beginning. And we always expect there to be more alpha activity in the eyes closed. And we're seeing that. We're seeing more alpha activity. And we're still seeing this frontal beta going on. Eye blink. I had him blink his eyes a few times here. And you know what? Just for funsies, while we're doing this, I'm going to put on my little neuronic helmet that is so graciously being loaned to me by the wonderful Jordan Hamlin. Run a session while I'm doing some EEG processing, right? Why not? This is the Neuradiant 1070 device, my little controller here. So getting some nice 1070 infrared stimulation right now. Right now we're doing 14 hertz. All right, so we got eye blink. I told him to blink. I told him to clench his jaw. And of course, we're going to wait until the eye blink is done to actually start really processing these things. And the good news is, if you found that first half incredibly tedious or uninteresting, this is going to be no better. Although it looks like, I mean, we don't have eye blink to process. So really, we're only trying to get out the sensor instabilities that are happening here. It looks like C4 has some pops. It looks like P8 still has some pops. And so far, it looks like whatever is happening at CZ is not so bad. I really don't understand why these like pops seem to happen in sequence from each other. But they're not so bad. Here we have an instance where the slowing starts to get a little sharper. And we do expect to see a little bit more kind of potentially gnarly or concerning instabilities in the eyes closed, because people tend to go through more state changes as far as vigilance and wakefulness is concerned in the eyes closed. And state changes when we see more local instabilities happening. And this is kind of a perfect example of that. Lo and behold, we have a sort of drop out of the background rhythm, which is associated with sort of B stages of sleep. We have beta spindles and a reduction in the total band power of the EEG in the background happening. Classic spot for beta spindles at CZ. That's kind of like the wakefulness drive. We have a burst of alpha here, and then a local burst of alpha at T7, where we've seen it previously. So this may confirm the idea that there is some kind of local slowing that might be an instability that's happening at that left mid-temporal site, because it's really only happening at T7. Electrode pops, eye blink, jaw tension, posterior alpha. So we will try to clean this up using the ICA. And this whole ending part, I think we can just ignore. We're not even going to try to select that for the ICA, since we get eye blinks. Oh, looks like we should probably start even sooner. I started demonstrating this is where we should stop, is right around here. I had him open his eyes and started demonstrating what the raw EEG looks like on the screen. So obviously that's no longer a true eyes reflection of the eyes closed state. And I'm going to skip out on that first little bit because we don't want to muddy the ICA algorithm unnecessarily with stuff that's going to have to be pulled out manually anyways. We'll try the Infomax this first time around. Why did my camera just blink at me? I don't know. Hello, camera. All right. Feeling energized. The Neuradiant helmet. Or maybe it's just placebo. 14 hertz has sort of like a mildly activating effect in my experience. We're just doing this for 6 minutes at the 50% pulse width intensity right now. And what do we got here in the component topographies? We have this, what's likely some eyelid flutter. And here we have a nice P8 component that's doing a good job of getting that electrode instability out. We're also curious if we can get something to help us out with C4. That's doing a decent job. Do we want to try to get out PZ? I don't know. Let's scroll to a better section. The P8 component is reducing a little bit of the genuine alpha, but not egregiously so. Right now, I'm looking also for an FZ component, and it looks like we do not have a distinct one. It looks like we kind of have like a combination of FZ components, which is unfortunate. I can see there's nothing that's really gonna like totally pull that out. If we take out these two, our question is this also like removing genuine EEG? So far, it looks like it's not doing that bad of a job. There's the controller unit telling us that we're done with our 6-minute session. This is not sponsored by Neuronic, by the way, but thank you, Jordan, for letting me borrow your device. I do consulting for them, but so far they're not giving me a sponsorship. Actually, I think I have a discount code if you want to buy one of their devices. I think it's Nikki10. Leave a comment in this video if you do want a discount code, a referral code, and you're thinking about buying a beautiful Neuradiant 1070 photobiomodulation device. I'm a fan. So far, I am enjoying it. It's powerful. I really notice it. And I've only played around with the 14 and 40 hertz settings on it so far. And definitely a different subjective quality to both of them. And they're both energizing. 14 is a little subtler. 40 is definitely more powerful. I would not run 40 hertz in the nighttime for sure. It's kind of strong. So I was hoping we would get better components for getting rid of the pops that we saw. Unfortunately, we've only gotten rid of some of the stuff, but it's enough that we'll be able to get enough data for the Q without having to cut out too much. So we're going to start setting our voltage threshold conditions using the mark artifact feature. This will probably be too aggressive since this is what we use for the eyes open, but hey, let's see what we get. Yeah, that's pulling out too much, unfortunately. But this is a good example of a spot that we can use for reference. So we want to get this out. We want to keep this in. This is obviously going to be triggering, well, I don't know if it's obvious. This is triggering the absolute voltage condition. So let's switch this up to 80 and see what that does. Okay, it's pulling out less. And now I think it's picking up on the fast stuff there. So let's bump this up to 12. Look at that. Okay, we're getting better at this. Here, a little P3 pop that it's pulling out. That's good. O1 pop that it's pulling out. That's good. Again, the P3. So far it seems like we're pretty close. This doesn't need to be pulled out, but I don't know if we need to mess with it. And this ending piece, I'm just going to manually select up until the eye blinks start, because we're not actually interested in the eyes open condition for this file. So snip up to there, and we'll see how much data we get if we process the spectra based on this. I'm hoping that we didn't gloss over too much in the processing. Here we are, I'm getting all excited about processing the spectra and realizing that once again, we want to give the raw EEG its full due. And we do see this pattern of shifting through states. Not a lot of significant like dropouts of the background rhythm, but kind of shifting between pretty alpha dominance and a pretty high amount of beta, which in the EEG spectra tends not to show up as much since it's broadly distributed in frequency. It's just not as impressive in those Q graphs, especially because we're not currently doing a database comparison, so we don't have the sort of z-score differences to look at. We don't need them because visually I can see that this is kind of a high amount of beta activity. And, I would say there is a moderate amount of state instability that we do see. This is a good example. We see this sort of like bursty alpha stuff that comes through just for a moment and then followed by this more irritative looking kind of beta activity. Here's another example of the alpha looking kind of sharp. Not necessarily a so-called clinical finding. But interesting, and we're starting to see a picture of a lot of shifting between states. Here we see, kind of a dropout and then a resurgence of alphoid content with it looking a little bit spiky. Phase inversion from CZ to F8 and T8. So, right when we see CZ having a spiky thing and then it's phase inverted to T8, whoops, want to make it disappear. And C4 is kind of flat. This could be a sign that there is a source in the insula of this sort of spiky content. Jay Gunkelman has talked about far field phase reversals and the insula's role in generating features like this. So we may have some instability, in this case on the right insula, because we have field and phase from P8 to T8 and it's inverted to CZ. So that's something kind of to bookmark. In the eyes open, our main finding was in the left temporal region, left mid-temporal, and in the left superior parietal region. Here we're seeing a little bit more of the state instability and now also something that could be originating in the right insula. Insula can be significant if there is a um, gastric component, sort of like that felt sense of kind of the gut and the um, connection to uh, feeling rooted in the gut, kind of like the sense of self in that embodied area. Here we see kind of more spiky stuff. Um, this time also sort of phase inverted from CZ to the right temporal. It's less obvious and spiky in this instance. So, what is it that we're looking for? Well, I don't know. And this person's a friend and has sort of spoken a little bit about what he's interested in exploring and also what some of his symptoms are. I'll share that sort of like the negative symptoms that he identified were occasional issues with sort of anxiety and kind of anger bubbling up. And, to me, the fact that we do see this relatively high amount of frontal beta activity could be a match for that. And sort of this hyperexcitability, not just frontally in the beta content, but also seemingly in some of the parietal regions as well, may be a sign that there's a kind of dysregulation leaning towards hyperexcitability, hyperarousal symptoms. And I don't want to read too much into it, but that right insula potential finding, and now we are seeing T8 slowing in sort of the slow alpha band, which could indicate some sort of ischemic changes on the right side. Um, that could certainly have an impact on emotional affective regulation as far as this kind of like disturbed sense of embodied self, or even like a threatened sense of embodied self. And some might say that that's reading too much into it, and it could totally be right. Right, the goal here is not to problematize the EEG, but we are curious the story that the EEG is trying to tell us. Now, this one's interesting because it's curious. We see this like sort of spiky phenomenon that has like this F3 component, and it's seems like it has like a real following of like a little bit of a beta wave. Uh, it's hard to see if there's like real field and phase to this, like if this is a real EEG feature. We wouldn't be totally surprised to see a kind of spike with this amplitude and topography, although I am perplexed by the topography. There's enough of it showing up in different channels that we can't just dismiss it offhand as some sort of electrode pop. If I'm dragging F3 down to P3 right now, and we see that it's basically phase offset between those two sites and sort of inverted, and P7. And we haven't really seen anything else at 3 that looked like that, although we do see some beta spindling sort of throughout the record, which could indicate that a spike instability was not out of the question. CZ beta spindles, this can be associated, this is sort of the classic biomarker for difficulty with sleep onset, with falling asleep. It's associated with the wakefulness drive and orexin. Let's look at the spectra, shall we? All right, what do we got? We have a primary alpha peak that is on the faster side, which is associated with intelligence, quick processing. And we see a slower alpha peak, which again could be a sign of ischemic changes, blood flow changes, and potentially arousal instability. So I'm going to create a map for that. This beta activity is real beta activity. And if we go over to the right side here, are there any other features that we haven't captured yet? No. We've basically gotten the 2 alpha peaks, and they do have, whoopsie. We were supposed to get this. Where's that faster one? Oh, it's over here. All right, we've duplicated these. We don't need this one. And we don't need this one either. So these are our significant findings, and lo and behold, the faster alpha and the beta stuff has found its way into the same electrode. And we're not getting that different of a picture than what we got in the eyes open, actually. So here we have come to the point where it's time to do some kind of interpretation. I wonder if I can zoom in any further to this. I don't think I can. That's as far as I can zoom in. Here, what if I do it this way? Oh, wait. I'm new at this. There it is. That's a little bit better. So I would be curious to explore how it is that we can stabilize this left superior parietal region using neurofeedback, and how to stabilize the kind of arousal that we see, which seems to be allowing the alpha rhythm to shift around in kind of both of these conditions. The beta spindling that is present is probably causing some difficulty in falling asleep and impacting sleep quality. So I am curious for some kind of hard data on sleep quality and how long it takes to fall asleep and the different elements of the sleep architecture, which could be measured with, for starters, just even something like the Oura Ring or an Apple Watch. And I do believe that addressing this sort of hyperexcitability in sort of the whole cortex and specifically this parietal region could potentially be helpful in gaining some control over those anxiety and potential irritability symptoms. So I would be interested in utilizing neurofeedback to inhibit some of this beta activity, and also using neurofeedback to get the alpha rhythm to kind of organize more coherently and consistently with itself. Because generally, this dual alpha peak phenomenon is not ideal as far as the person's like subjective experience of kind of balanced energy and um, effective processing. So that's something that I'm excited to explore. We're going to try out some protocols on the Divergence platform to address these things. Stay tuned, subscribe to the channel, because this is a case that we can follow up on and actually look at how the EEG changes over time in response to neurofeedback, neurostimulation, and potentially other interventions as well, lifestyle, photobiomodulation, nutritional changes, if that's of interest to this guy. So if you made it this far, thank you for watching. Please leave any questions or comments below in the YouTube video. If you want to learn more, if anything is unclear, or if you have any potential insights or feedback or even disagreements with what I teased apart in this initial look at the CEG. So thanks so much for watching. This is EEG Worlds. My name is Nikki, and we'll see you on the next episode.